The evening sun was sinking behind the dusty hills, spilling golden light across the quiet ranch. Horses shifted slowly behind the wooden fence, their hooves brushing against dry earth. A warm wind carried the smell of hay and leather through the air. It was the kind of evening that made the whole world feel softer, calmer. But for him, evenings like this had always carried something heavier. For 15 long years he had stood in the same place in her life, close enough to see her smile, close enough to hear her laugh, but never close enough to speak the truth resting deep inside his chest. Most people in the small frontier town believed they knew his story. They saw a quiet ranch hand who worked harder than anyone else and spoke less than most. They saw a man who fixed fences, broke wild horses, and kept to himself when the town gathered at the saloon. Folks respected him. Some even admired him. But no one truly understood the silence he carried, because his silence had a reason. Every morning he watched the same cabin door open. Every afternoon he saw her walking past the fields with a basket in her arms. Sometimes she waved. Sometimes she stopped for a short conversation about the weather or the horses. Her voice was gentle, warm, and familiar. It had been that way since the day she first arrived in town. Back then she had looked lost but hopeful. The dust of travel still clung to her dress, and the whole town watched as she stepped off the wagon that carried her west. Something in her eyes caught his attention that day. Maybe it was the strength behind her quiet smile. Maybe it was the way she stood tall even when the wind pushed against her. From that moment, something settled inside his heart, something steady, something that refused to fade no matter how many years passed. But life in the Old West had its own way of shaping people. Work came first, survival came first. Feelings were the kind of things men buried deep beneath calloused hands and long days under the burning sun. So he kept quiet. He helped repair her roof after a storm once. Another time he brought back a runaway horse that wandered near her field. During winter he chopped extra firewood and left it stacked neatly by her door before sunrise. He never waited for thanks. He never asked for anything in return. Still, every small kindness carried words he never allowed himself to say. Years rolled by like slow wagon wheels on an endless trail. Seasons changed. Winters hardened the land and spring softened it again. Through it all, she remained part of his everyday life, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there. The town changed too. New families arrived, old faces moved on. But the quiet bond between them remained untouched, hidden beneath years of silence. Until that evening, the sky burned orange and gold as the sun slipped behind the mountains. She stood by the wooden fence near the pasture, her eyes shining in the fading light. A tear slowly traced down her cheek. He had seen her cry only once before. His chest tightened the moment he noticed it. Without thinking, he stepped closer and rested a steady hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him then, surprise and sadness mixed together in her expression. For a long moment neither of them spoke. 15 years of unspoken words stood between them. The wind rustled through the dry grass. Horses shifted quietly behind the fence. Somewhere in the distance a barn door creaked. And then, for the first time since the day she arrived in town, he finally opened his mouth to speak. The words that followed would change both their lives forever. But the moment he said them, the tear in her eye turned into something neither of them expected. The moment his words left his mouth, the world seemed to grow quiet around them. Even the horses behind the fence stood still, as if the evening itself had paused to listen. She stared at him, her eyes wide, the tears still resting on her cheek. For years she had known him as the quiet man who worked the ranch land with steady hands and patient strength. He was the one who fixed broken gates, who rode out before sunrise, and who never stayed long in crowded places. But she had never heard him speak like that. His voice carried something different that evening. It was calm, yet heavy with years of buried truth. The kind of truth a man carries for so long that it becomes part of his bones. Her breath caught for a moment. She looked down at the ground, trying to gather her thoughts, but the words he had spoken echoed in her mind again and again. 15 years? She slowly wiped the tear from her cheek, though another quickly replaced it. The fading sunlight brushed against her face, making the moment feel almost unreal. "You never said anything," she finally whispered. He looked out toward the open pasture, his jaw tightening slightly. Speaking did not come easily to him. Silence had always been safer. Silence asked for nothing and promised nothing. But tonight something had changed. I figured it was better that way, he answered quietly. She shook her head slowly, confusion and emotion mixing together in her expression. For years she had believed she understood the people in this small western town. Life here was simple in many ways. Everyone knew each other's business. News traveled faster than a horse on a clear trail. Yet somehow this had remained hidden. Her eyes drifted toward the old barn standing in the distance. The same barn that had stood there when she first arrived all those years ago. The memory of that day returned to her slowly. The wagon ride west had been long and unforgiving. Dust had filled the air for miles, and the road had stretched across endless land that felt both hopeful and frightening at the same time. She had come searching for a new beginning after losing the only home she had known back east. The town had seemed small when she first saw it. A few buildings, a dirt road, and wide fields stretching toward distant mountains. But there had been something peaceful about it. She remembered stepping down from the wagon and seeing him standing across the street. He had not said a word back then either, just watching quietly. At the time she assumed he was simply another curious townsman, but later she began to notice small things. A broken fence near her cabin would be fixed before she even had time to ask for help. When her horse slipped its rope one windy afternoon, it was he who brought the animal back before sunset. During one harsh winter, firewood kept appearing stacked neatly beside her door before dawn. She had always thanked him, of course, but she had never questioned why he did those things. Now the answers were standing right in front of her. The wind moved softly through the fields as the sun dropped lower behind the hills. Shadows stretched across the pasture, turning the land darker with every passing minute. He shifted his weight slightly, resting his arms against the fence rail. For a man who could ride through a storm and face down wild horses without fear, this moment felt strangely harder. "There were reasons," he said after a while. She turned toward him again, her brows drawing together. "What reasons?" He did not answer right away. Instead, he stared at the horizon where the last line of sunlight rested against the mountains. His expression carried something distant now, like a man looking back at years he could not change. The truth was, the silence had never been only about fear. 15 years earlier, when she first arrived, there had already been a storm forming around him, one that had nothing to do with weather or land. Very few people in town remembered it clearly anymore. Some had moved away, others preferred not to talk about it. But the past had a way of lingering, especially in places where the land itself seemed to remember every story. He finally took a slow breath. "If I had spoken back then," he said quietly, "things might have turned out different." Her heart began to beat faster as she studied his face. Different how? But before she could ask another question, the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats drifted across the evening air, breaking the fragile moment between them. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder across the quiet pasture, cutting through the fragile moment they had been sharing. Both of them turned toward the dirt road that curved along the edge of the ranch. A rider was approaching fast, dust rising behind the horse in a long trail. The man beside her straightened slightly, his eyes narrowing as he watched the figure draw closer. His shoulders tensed in a way she had not seen before. It was not fear exactly, but something close to it. Something heavy that seemed to come from old memories rather than the present moment. The rider slowed near the fence and pulled the horse to a stop. It was one of the town's ranch hands, a young fellow who often helped move cattle between pastures. His hat sat crooked on his head, and his horse breathed hard from the ride. "Sorry to ride in like this?" the young man said, glancing between the two of them. "But there are strangers asking questions in town." The quiet ranch hand did not answer right away. His gaze remained fixed on the rider, his expression hardening in a way that made the air feel colder. "What kind of questions?" he asked. The young rider shifted in the saddle. "Asking about you?" A strange silence settled over the fence line. The woman felt a small chill run through her chest. She looked at the man beside her, noticing how still he had become. His jaw tightened slightly and his eyes drifted back toward the fading horizon. The rider continued carefully. "They came in earlier today?" 2 men, not locals. Been stopping folks on the street, asking how long you've been here, asking about the old trouble. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Old trouble, the woman felt her stomach tighten. In 15 years she had heard whispers now and then, quiet conversations that ended when she entered a room. But no one had ever told her anything clearly. When she asked, people simply shrugged or changed the subject. She looked at him again. The same quiet man who had fixed her roof, who had brought her horse home, who had stood beside her through countless small moments over the years. What had he been carrying all this time? The writer tipped his hat nervously. Folks in town thought you should know. He nodded once. I appreciate it. The young man hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure whether he should say more. Finally, he turned the horse and rode back toward town, the sound of hooves fading slowly into the distance. The pasture grew quiet again. But the peace from earlier was gone. The woman folded her arms lightly against the evening breeze. You knew something like this might happen. It was not a question. He rested his hands on the fence rail, staring out at the darkening land. For a long moment he said nothing. When you live long enough with a past, he finally said, it has a way of catching up. She studied him carefully. The man she had known for 15 years suddenly felt like a stranger standing beside her. What kind of past are they looking for? He let out a slow breath. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across his face, making him look older than she remembered. There was a time, he said quietly, before this town. Before the ranch work. Before all the quiet days, her heart began to beat faster again. What happened? He rubbed a rough hand along the back of his neck, as if searching for the right place to begin. I rode with a group of men back then, he said. Not the kind people write songs about. The wind moved through the pasture grass, whispering across the fields. The woman felt a knot tighten inside her chest. You mean outlaws? He did not answer with words. But the silence told her enough. The idea seemed impossible to connect with the man she had known all these years. The man who fixed fences and carried water buckets and treated every horse with patient care. Yet something in his eyes now made the story feel real. She turned away from the fence for a moment, trying to steady her thoughts. The peaceful life she had built here suddenly felt fragile. And those men in town, she said slowly, they are looking for you because of that? His voice was low when he answered. Most likely. The sky had turned deep orange now, the last light fading behind the mountains. She faced him again, searching his expression. Why did you stay silent all these years? She asked softly. His eyes met hers again, and for the first time that evening the truth seemed close enough to touch. But before he could answer, a distant gunshot echoed somewhere across the valley, rolling through the darkening land like a warning carried on the wind. The sharp crack of the gunshot rolled across the valley and faded into the evening air. For a moment neither of them moved. The horses in the pasture lifted their heads, restless, sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the quiet ranch. The woman looked toward the distant hills where the sound had come from. Her heart was beating faster now, each second stretching longer than the last. That came from near town, she said quietly. The man beside her had already straightened, his body alert in a way she had never seen before. The calm ranch hand she had known for years seemed to shift into someone older, someone shaped by a harder life. His eyes scanned the horizon, calculating. It could be nothing, he said, though his tone suggested he did not believe that. The wind moved across the dry grass again, carrying with it the distant echo of another sound. This time it was not a gunshot. It was the faint rumble of several horses moving quickly along the road. Her stomach tightened. You think those strangers found you? He did not answer right away. Instead, he stepped away from the fence and walked toward the barn, his stride steady but purposeful. She followed without thinking. For years, she had believed she knew every piece of his quiet life. Now each step revealed something different, something hidden beneath the surface. Inside the barn, the air smelled of hay, leather, and dust warmed by the day's sun. He moved toward a saddle resting on a wooden stand and began tightening the straps with quick, practiced hands. You are leaving, she said. He paused for a moment before answering. If those men are looking for trouble, I would rather meet them away from here. Her chest tightened at his words. Away from here means away from this ranch, He lifted the saddle and placed it over the back of his horse. The animal shifted but remained calm under his touch. "This place should stay out of it," he said quietly. She stepped closer, her voice stronger now. "You lived here for 15 years. This is your home too." The words seemed to land heavily between them. For a moment he stopped what he was doing. His hand rested against the horse's neck as he stared at the barn wall, thinking, home. It had been a long time since he allowed himself to think of any place that way. The woman watched him carefully. The lantern light hanging from a beam cast soft shadows across his face, revealing the conflict behind his steady expression. "Those men," she said slowly. "Are they from your past?" He nodded once. "Men I rode with a long time ago," he replied. "Or men connected to them. And they are coming here now, looks that way." Outside, the sound of horses grew louder again. This time there was no mistaking it. Several riders were approaching along the road that led toward the ranch. Her pulse quickened. "You cannot face them alone?" He finished securing the saddle and turned to face her fully. For a moment, the two of them stood in silence beneath the dim lantern light. "I have faced worse," he said. She shook her head. "That is not the point." He studied her expression carefully. In her eyes he saw the same strength he had noticed the first day she stepped down from that wagon 15 years ago. The same determination that had quietly shaped her life here. "You spent 15 years protecting this town," she continued softly, "helping people, working the land. Maybe it is time someone stands beside you." The words struck deeper than she realized. For years he had believed his past made him someone who should stand alone. Someone who solved his own problems without bringing danger to others. But now the past was riding straight toward the place he cared about most. The distant hoofbeats grew louder again, close enough now that dust could be seen drifting along the road beyond the fields. He stepped toward the barn door and looked out into the fading light. 3 riders had appeared at the far end of the ranch road. They were moving slowly now, scanning the land around them, searching. The woman came to stand beside him. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Are those the men?" His eyes followed the riders carefully. "Yes." One of the riders lifted an arm, pointing toward the barn. The horses began moving forward again. The tension in the air thickened as the riders closed the distance between them. He reached for the reins of his horse, his mind racing through choices that would shape everything that followed. Behind him stood the woman he had loved in silence for 15 long years. Ahead of him waited the past he had tried to leave behind. And as the riders approached the barn, the moment that would decide both their futures was finally beginning. The 3 riders slowed their horses as they reached the edge of the ranch yard. Dust settled around them while the last light of the sun faded behind the hills. For a long moment no one spoke. The quiet land that had known years of peaceful work now felt tight with old memories and unfinished business. The man stepped forward from the barn doorway, leaving his horse where it stood. His shoulders were straight, his eyes steady. The woman remained a few steps behind him, her heart pounding but her feet refusing to move away. One of the riders pushed his hat back and studied him carefully. His face carried the rough look of someone who had spent too many years on the road. "Well now," the rider said slowly. "Looks like we finally found you." The ranch hand did not look away. "You were not trying very hard to hide." The rider gave a short laugh. "Word travels. A man like you does not disappear forever." The other 2 riders shifted in their saddles, glancing around the ranch as if measuring the land and the barn and the fences that had become part of his quiet life. The woman watched them closely. These men belonged to the life he had once hinted at. The life of long rides, bad decisions, and roads that never seemed to end in peace. The first rider leaned forward slightly. "We heard you turned yourself into a ranchman, fixing fences, feeding horses, that true?" "It is," he replied calmly. Another rider spoke then, his voice rough but curious. "Funny thing, we came expecting a different man." The ranch hand folded his arms slowly. "People change." The men looked at each other for a moment, something unspoken passing between them. The leader sighed and rested his hands on the saddle horn. "You remember that mess 15 years back," he said. "When the whole thing fell apart." The memory flashed through the ranch hand's mind. A reckless group of riders chasing quick money. A mistake that had gone too far. The moment he realized he did not belong on that road anymore. "I remember," he said. The rider nodded slowly. "Truth is that trouble followed the rest of us a long time. Folks blamed you for leaving. Said you walked away when things got rough." The ranch hand shook his head quietly. "I walked away because it was wrong." Silence settled again. The woman stepped closer then, her voice calm but strong. "He spent 15 years helping people in this town. If you came looking for the man he used to be, you are too late." The riders looked at her with mild surprise. The leader studied the ranch hand again, this time more carefully. The fences around the pasture were well kept. The horses looked strong and calm. The barn had the quiet order of a place built with patience. "This all yours?" the rider asked. He glanced back toward the woman for a moment before answering. "Part of it." The rider slowly nodded. "Then maybe you did the right thing after all." The tension that had filled the ranch yard began to ease little by little. One of the riders turned his horse slightly toward the road. "We did not come here for revenge," the leader finally said. "Truth is, we were just curious. A man disappearing like that makes folks wonder." The ranch hand held his gaze. "You have your answer." For another moment the riders lingered. Then the leader tipped his hat once. "Take care of that life you built," he said. "Not many men get the chance to start over." With that, the three riders turned their horses and began riding back toward the road. The sound of their hooves slowly faded into the evening, leaving the ranch quiet once again. The woman let out a long breath she did not realize she had been holding. The man stood still for a moment, watching the road until the riders disappeared completely. Then he turned back toward the barn. The lantern light glowed softly behind them, and the first stars had begun to appear in the dark sky above the fields. "You were ready to leave tonight," she said quietly. He nodded. "I thought it was the only way to keep trouble away from you." She stepped closer, her eyes warm now. "For 15 years you carried everything alone," she said. "You do not have to do that anymore." The words settled deep in his chest. The same place where silence had lived for so long. He looked at her carefully, the way he had countless times across the years. But this time there was no distance between what he felt and what he allowed himself to say. "I meant every word I told you earlier," he said, her eyes softened. "I know," she replied. A small smile finally reached his face, something rare but genuine. The ranch, the quiet western land, the horses, and the long road behind him all seemed to lead to this simple moment. 15 years of silence had ended. And as the night settled over the peaceful ranch, the future that once felt impossible now stood quietly in front of them, waiting to begin.